Aloha kako, aloha mai. I am Haunani-Kay Trask, a descendant of the Pi'ilani line of Maui through my mother, and of the Kahaku Makali'ua line of Kauai through my father. I grew up on the Ko'olau side of Oahu, and I reside now in Hei'ia, one of the Ahu Pua'a surrounding Kaneohe Bay. My people, the Hawaiian people, have been in these islands since the time of Papa and Wa'akea, or according to the archaeologists, for over 2,000 years. Tonight, I'm going to relate a story that begins with the genocide of a native people and ends with an attempt to silence one of their survivors and fiercest defenders, namely myself. It is a story of white cultural and economic imperialism in its broadest outlines, and of white hegemony and white racism on this campus. Specifically, it is a story of the politics of academic freedom as the politics of white racism. Let me tell you now, first, how a white foreign world, that is the world of the Haole, came to occupy the world of the native, that is the world of Hawaiians. In 1778, a white foreigner came to our land with a pestilential shipload of other foreigners. They wanted women, water, food, and general recreation, for which they gave Hawaiians syphilis, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, and ideas of predatory Christianity, capitalism, and individualism. 42 years later, in 1820, a different class of aggressive Haole, animated by the hatred of all things dark and sexual, brought measles, chicken pox, and a virulent determination to replace the Hawaiian world with the Haole world. They were called missionaries, and they were bent on conversion of my people and the dispossession of our lands and waters. By this time, that is 1820, 750,000 Hawaiians were dead, directly the result of the coming of the Haole. Conveniently for the missionaries, the Hawaiian universe had collapsed under the impact of mass death. The fertile field of conversion was littered with the remnants of Holocaust, a Holocaust created by Haole and celebrated by Haole as the will of a Christian God. By the 1880s, most of our lands were owned by these same white American foreigners who had convinced our chiefs that private property would give our people everlasting physical life. In 1893, when Hawaiians were but 5% of what they had been at contact, and when most of our arable lands were in the hands of foreigners, the American Marines invaded and occupied our country, overthrew and imprisoned our chiefly leaders, and forcibly took Hawaii. In 1898, we were annexed to the United States against the wishes of the Hawaiian people. By 1900, all Hawaiian language schools were closed. Political and economic life was dictated by the Haole, and American institutions overtook the last vestiges of Hawaiian culture. From this point forward into the 20th century, Hawaiians became increasingly like other native peoples, conquered and subordinated in their own homeland. Now we suffer a declining population, continued land dispossession, and ongoing destruction of our cultural ways. As a nation and a people, Hawaiians are no longer self-determining. For Hawaiians, American colonialism has been a violent process. The violence of mass death, the violence of American missionizing, the violence of cultural destruction, the violence of the American military. Once the United States annexed my homeland, a new kind of violence took place, the violence of educational colonialism, where foreign Haole values replace Native Hawaiian values, where schools like the University of Hawaii ridicule Hawaiian culture and praise American culture, and where white men assume the mantle of authority, deciding what is taught, who can teach, even what can be said, written, and published. In Colony Hawaii, the university stands atop the educational pyramid of the state. People of color comprise over 70% of the student body, while the faculty are over 70% Haole. For Hawaiians, the situation is worse. 13 tenured Hawaiian faculty compare with nearly 660 tenured Haole faculty. This situation is called institutional racism. Enter into this white male university a white male student named Joey Carter, lately come from the American South, where whites are not only dominant, but where white supremacist organizations are on the rise. Complaining in a public letter to the student newspaper Kaleo, Mr. Carter mistakenly says that words like, quote, Haole-dominated society, end quote, and, quote, puppet Haole governments, end quote, are racist. That the word Haole is like the word nigger. that white suppression, repression, persecution, and domination of non-whites is, quote, supposed, as opposed to actual. That he was chased and beaten by locals because of his skin and eye color. And finally, that people are individuals as opposed to members of historical groups who, quote, classify themselves as they like. Clearly, Mr. Carter was feeling uncomfortable in Hawaii, where white people do not have the usual majority, nor the unquestioned ability to categorize others as they so lovingly do on the American continent. Quickly following on this letter came dozens of replies in Kaleo, including one by myself, in which Mr. Carter was instructed about his place, his history, and his role in Hawaii. Educating Mr. Carter, I explained that, quote, haole is in fact one of the few surviving Hawaiian language descriptions in common use in Hawaii. I went on to say that Carter's appeal to, quote, individual exemption from the power and privilege of white hegemony is itself a typical American ploy to avoid responsibility for an ugly and vicious history that visited genocide on American Indians, slavery on Africans, peonage on Asians, and dispossession of both lands and self-government on Native Hawaiians. I informed Mr. Carter that he is a direct beneficiary, as are all white people, of racism. That is, a system of power in which one racially identified group dominates and exploits another racially identified group for the benefit of the exploiting group. In the United States, people of color do not have the power to practice racism against white people. The same is true in Hawaii, particularly in regard to Native Hawaiians, who are, contrary to Mr. Carter's beliefs, not free to classify themselves, but are legally classified by the American government regarding blood quantum. Hawaiians of 50% or more blood quantum are native. Those of less blood quantum are not native. Finally, I argued that the hatred and fear people of color have of white people is born of experience, the experience of white violence. I closed my statement by suggesting that if Mr. Carter did not like Hawaii, our language, or our ways of doing things, he could leave, since Hawaiians would certainly benefit from one less haole in our homeland. And I might say in response to Ken Kipnis that Mr. Carter never was a student in my class. I have never met or seen or spoken with Mr. Carter. My article was published on September 19th. 5 days later, on September 24th, Larry Loudon, who refuses to debate with me, chair of the philosophy department, and himself a recently arrived haole in Hawaii, wrote a letter to Vice President Paul Ewan demanding my public reprimand for voicing such views and arguing that I was an administrator and therefore a spokesperson for the university. His request was followed by a philosophy department resolution called quaintly a statement on racism in academe, alleging that my public reply to Mr. Carter was racist, condoned, quote, violence against a member of the university community solely because of his social identity and opinions, end quote, and consequently betrayed a, quote, most basic professional responsibility, end quote, which they defined as a, quote, special duty to protect and sustain the fragile atmosphere within which ideas can be assessed on their merits, end quote. Specifically, the philosophy department alleged that my invitation to Carter to leave Hawaii was similar to a white professor declaring black students unwelcome and proposing that they return to Africa. We have a color problem here. This resolution was sent by Larry Loudon to Vice President Ewan on October 15th, requesting that I be removed from my position of alleged administrative authority. They need to read the contract, those people in philosophy. This resolution was distributed widely to the press by Larry Loudon and others and was answered by President Simone on November 2nd, assuring his good friend, quote, Larry, end quote, that, quote, administrators may not speak for the University of Hawaii without appropriate consultation with senior officers of the university, end quote. Does this sound familiar? The president ended his letter by saying that his administration does not condone creating, quote, an unfriendly, intimidating, and non-supportive environment for faculty and students, end quote. On November 3rd, the faculty union reaffirmed academic freedom at the university, thank God somebody did, quote, for the expression of all points of view regarding the racial issues recently raised on the Manoa campus and endorsing fair and open debate about race, colonialism, and any other related issues in Hawaii. The union went on to reaffirm that I was not an administrator. On November 8th, President Simone announced his intention to conduct an investigation into my statements. thus violating all semblance of confidentiality, which he is very concerned about protecting regarding white male sexual harassers. Simone told the advertiser by phone from Japan that he believed I was an administrator. He doesn't read the contract either. And that administrators must accept, quote, the principle that some things are better off not said publicly, end quote. I think it's clear that Simone had made up his mind by this point. I mean, I think that's clear to everybody. While Simone conducted his investigation, the Faculty Senate began their own, triggered by the same Philosophy Department resolution. For the first time in its history, the Faculty Senate, another white male bastion, decided to investigate a fellow faculty member for written public statements. Without precedent and without procedures, the Faculty Senate moved ahead on the basis of the Philosophy Department resolution. Thus, by the middle of November, the witch hunt had begun in earnest, and the White Male Boys Club was hysterical. Indeed, white men led the charge, with people like Gary Fuller of geography comparing me to Hitler and Saddam Hussein, and Dick Miller of the law school telling the Faculty Senate that my thinking was similar to that which led to the rise of Nazi Germany and which resulted in the internment of Japanese Americans. Ken Kipnis, my worthy opponent, told one of my faculty supporters that the Hawaiian movement was like the KKK and that I would have to decide whether I wanted to be a professor or a member of the Hawaiian movement. Charges of impending violence against white people surfaced everywhere, with the most virulent being made by Larry Loudon, proclaiming that I was, quote, giving hunting licenses, end quote, to my students and other Hawaiians to, quote, beat up on haoles. This is the same Larry Loudon who told KHON News, who I'm glad is here tonight, that my, quote, brand of radicalism did not belong in a university, while attacking a rally in my defense as a form of terrorism on the campus. Despite numerous calls on my part and that of my supporters for Loudon and others who disagreed with me to come forward and debate, is this a university or not, I was charged and condemned as a racist. The phenomenon known as McCarthyism, where individuals are accused falsely and never given an opportunity to confront or disprove their accusers, began to characterize the campus atmosphere. Hate calls and hate mail began appearing in Hawaiian studies. Kaleo ran a poll asking if students thought I was a racist. They didn't run a poll asking if they thought Larry Loudon was a racist. Stickers began to appear on campus, attacking me personally and raising the specter of white supremacist groups. The Faculty Senate proceeded, as did Al Simone, both determined to condemn me without once speaking with me. Indeed, most of my accusers had never read or thought seriously about my statement. They were content to read what the Philosophy Department had said. And of course, this is where the problem begins. The Philosophy Department, like Joey Carter, is ignorant of scholarly and novelistic studies and portrayals of racism, especially by those by Black Americans and by Africans. Thinking that racism is a matter of color and not of history and power, the Philosophy Department intentionally misread my statements, which Larry Loudon intentionally and viciously recast, saying that I was justifying violence against Mr. Carter. But I never justified violence against Mr. Carter. I justified our right as Native Hawaiians to resent haoles who come here and complain about my land and my culture and my history. That's what I said. I explained the long history of white violence against people of color precisely to educate Mr. Carter, since the Philosophy Department wasn't doing that, about his place and his history. It is white people and not people of color who have a history of violence against others. It is the haole who stole my land, took our government, destroyed our nationhood, and suppressed our culture. It is white people who created laws to divide Hawaiians by blood quantum. It is white people who created institutions foreign to our ways of life. It is white people who brought capitalism to Hawaii. In other words, it is white people who have exploited and oppressed Hawaiians for their own benefit. And the least people like Mr. Carter could do is be a little more understanding of that history. Like most haole, Mr. Carter did not know or want to learn any of this. But if I did not argue for violence against the haole, then why did the philosophy department say that I did? The answer, I believe, lies in the fears and resentments of haole themselves. Here in Hawaii, haole have grown very accustomed to the myth of racial harmony, put out by the politicians and the tourist industry. They live in predominantly white or Asian neighborhoods, and if they know anything at all about Hawaiians, it is that we have a funny, unpronounceable language. We appear on television as activists or other lawbreakers trying to stop development. And we have a deep wound called the overthrow, when the all-white American government took our sovereignty. Yes, haole in Hawaii are very nervous because they know wrongs were committed in their names and for their benefit. So, when an uppity Native woman educates one of their own about his white history and his obligations to Natives, their fears and their angers spill over into crazy accusations that, if we examine, reflect back on their own sick history of violence. As Frantz Fanon and Malcolm X and Angela Davis and Ngugi and a host of other black people have taught us, dark skin and dark people are the classic bogeyman of the haole. White people know that all over the world, people of color have been brutally and unjustly treated by white imperialism. They know our grievances are real, so they imagine how much more violent we would be to them than they have been to us, because we have a real history of grievances. This is why every demand for respect and recognition of dignity on our part is read always as a sign of violence. This is why white people so fear black people in the United States, despite the fact that it's white people who have a history of violence against black people and not the other way around. White violence has a long history and a sick history in the world, in the Americas, in the Pacific, in Hawaii, White power and white racism are alive and well on this campus. Where else but in a colony would a Native woman be investigated by 3 committees for exercising her right as a Native and a citizen to publicly criticize a white man? Where else but in a colony would white administrators talk babble about, quote, responsible speech? Do they mean the responsible speech of Larry Loudon defending certain forms of sexual harassment in a student publication called Voices? Do they mean the responsible speech of Ian Reid, another white man, arguing the mental inferiority of women in the same student magazine? Do they mean the responsible speech of Dick Miller, accusing me publicly in the faculty senate of creating an atmosphere similar to the one that led to Nazi Germany and the internment of the Japanese? Mr. Miller doesn't know his history. White people made Nazi Germany. White people interned Japanese, not Hawaiians. Thank you very much. In the long history of Hawaii, it is white people who have a violence against Hawaiians, Filipinos, Japanese. All right. Why is their speech responsible and my speech is not? Responsible speech, in other words, as it is defined by white men, creates the parameters of academic freedom. White men can say all the manner of dangerous, violent, and false things, in fact, absolute lies, and they are protected. Their speech is protected. But I have told the truth. I have told the truth. I'm willing to debate the truth of what I said, but nobody wants to debate the truth. They just want me to shut up. All right, I've got 2 minutes, so I have to skip part of this. But I want to end, I know, I think this should be 1 hour. I want to say something about Mr. Carter's response. He wrote a public statement, and he should be responsible for his statements instead of running away and relying on the philosophy department. But now I want to quote from, because it's very important, the climate. The whole thing is my climate. I create climate. I make rain, snow, thunder, lightning. I create a climate of racial intimidation at the scribble of my pen. Notice how powerful Hawaiian women are. All right. Let me say what Tom Gething has just concluded in his investigation, which I assume is not confidential since I was the one who was attacked, but I don't have to wait for the Office of Information Practices in Kalea release the confidential information. I'm going to release it right here publicly. Tom Gething found, the Dean of Students, quote, "I have found no evidence that Dr. Trask, who has never met or spoken with Mr. Carter, discriminated against him in regard to his race or color. I have found considerable evidence that hostile environment in regard to race or color exists at the University of Hawaii Manoa. This condition existed prior to Mr. Carter's column." And Dr. Trask's response: "It is very dangerous for all of us on this campus who prize public debate, and thank God Majid Taranian did this because there were so many cowards who would not co-sponsor this debate because they are terrified of the truth. Thank God Majid did this," who, by the way, is a person of color and comes from Iran. The fact is that we are living in dangerous times. Where is our president? I submit to you that he is protecting white male power. Thank you.